7, Research and Information Skills. This week we're looking at the question of how do I get started with my research. The outline for this week includes things like writing an essay, and I have to say that during the lecture I normally take a 20-minute interlude to describe the background to writing an essay and the basic structure and format, using a fairly classical model, and one that I was taught and one that I prefer. We also look at question analysis, and I do that several times over the next couple of weeks at least. And then we look at the possibility of developing a research strategy, and on top of that a research plan. The first slide related to this, slide 3 I should say, it looks at the steps to writing an essay, and for me perhaps one of the most important steps is the analysis of the question that you're given. So if you're given an essay question, or maybe several, and you choose one, it's the process of actually unpacking or breaking that down into component parts and working out what exactly you need to find to actually do the correct amount of research, get the right material, the most accurate material, and then start to look at how you're going to compile that and put it into a piece of writing, which hopefully will answer the question and get you good grades. In terms of the circular diagram on slide 3, actually doing the research, for me personally, usually takes nearly as long as the actual writing. So I will spend, say for instance, a model that I always used was a format model, where the first week I'd look at doing research and finding out the material that I needed, and then the second week I'd write, and I did this for most of my assignments. The key part perhaps is the plan for the actual essay, and one of the ways you can do that is by literally pulling out all the quotes and the material that you want to use from the research that you've done, compiling it in a way that you can literally see it on a page. In essence, then you can build your essay around that. Or, I guess in a slightly more mechanical way, you can do a map for each paragraph, and work out exactly where each source is going to appear, and it doesn't matter initially whether that plan actually comes to fruition, because there may be aspects of change as you go along, and I personally find that writing seems to take its own direction in many respects, and so you end up jettisoning sources that perhaps you thought were going to be very good, end up not quite fitting with how you're writing or what you've written. But anyway, it's important to have some sort of plan, and that's both in terms of your research and also particularly in terms of your writing. Some sort of map or a blueprint about taking research and sources and putting them into paragraph forms. The other thing that I draw your attention to is number 5, which is the edit. And I've said this before, and I've certainly reiterated it in class enough times. It's one of my personal mantras that in terms of proofreading and editing your work, that becomes one of the central aspects of writing, good writing. As far as I'm concerned, there's at least 1 or 2 grades in a good edit. So providing you give yourself enough time to actually write the piece, do a draft, and then walk away from it for 2 or 3 days, so it's actually fairly new to you when you come back, you generally find that the editing process that happens after those 2 or 3 days is fairly profound. It tightens the work up, it makes the connection stronger, and the presentation better. For me personally, I always figured that there was at least 2 grades in the edit or in the proofread, so I always concentrated quite heavily on that, even though sometimes I was incredibly bored with a piece of work. So if you've written 2,000 or 3,000 words and you've been over it many times, you might be reluctant to do it for a last time, but trust me, that last time can sometimes be the difference between, say for instance, a credit and a distinction. Simple corrections, think oversights for instance, not just typos, but also errors in how you've presented work, or how, say for instance, a sentence reads or could be interpreted. Those things are critical in terms of good writing and particularly appealing to an audience. On slide 4, I've looked at some of the key steps in this process. I don't necessarily need to repeat them or reiterate them here, but the fact is that something like taking stock, for instance, which is the second point that I put down, is a good way of actually outlining what you already know about a topic, and it's actually quite surprising when you sit and think about an essay question, for instance, that's in an area you've been studying. Initially you might think, well, I know very little about that, but there is material that you probably accreted from sitting in class, listening to other students, and certainly listening to your lecturer, and the readings that you've done, you'll have understandings that perhaps aren't necessarily conscious or don't seem to be conscious that you can bring to bear on a particular essay question or problem. And as I said, point 4 should be fairly obvious. You create a plan, and as I say, in class I often look at these 3 aspects, so the introduction, the body, where you might fit some of your sources, and how you actually structure these things around a particular work. Slide 5 deals with a kind of similar process, and slide 6 actually looks at and defines what some of the words that get used or that are used in the context of essay questions, and the actual instruction, the thing that you actually have to do when you read such instruction words. The key for me in any good essay is that the question has been dealt with in terms of breaking it down, as I put on slide 7, that obviously the instructions, the subject itself is elucidated or brought out to bear, other words that are significant. One of the key areas of breaking down an essay question is looking at the parameters, so looking at not only the subject, the thing that you have to actually examine or investigate, but also looking at the parameters. In the case of the question on slide 7, we have the fact that we're only looking at two European regions, for instance, so that's the parameters, we only have to look at those 2, and it's in a set period. So those are the crucial and significant words that we need to take out, and that literally helps us focus our research. I'd recommend that you attempt the activities. There's 2 activities from slides 8 and 10, if you can. I think it might be an interesting process for you to engage, if nothing else, that you can actually track and start to put into practice some of the things that I'm talking about in terms of breaking down questions and how you might tackle them. Moving to slide 11, I offer some fairly general advice. I suppose the points that I would like to draw your attention to is, well, there's perhaps 3. The first is that I state that the sooner you start reading, the quicker you begin to become familiar with the material, and then you can start developing ideas quite early, so you have an angle to attack the actual writing as early as possible. But the other points which relate to the ask yourself are questions like, what do I need to read to be able to answer the essay question? But also, and far more important, is this material useful? So the material that you're actually reading and delving into, is it going to be useful to the topic? In which case, if it's a yes or a no, and it is normally, you can immediately stop reading the material that you think is not going to help you, and obviously engage more in the material that you think will. And the other bit is will it actually support my answer in the context of my writing? In other words, can I use it as a reference? And I think this is crucial. Often these readings, other material is prescribed, so your lecturer will direct you towards certain readings, certain chapters in books, etc. In which case you'll know immediately whether it's actually going to be of any use to support your answer. Now that is kind of general advice. More specific advice relates to slide 12, where I look at how we might develop a research plan in terms of an action plan, effectively, about what we're going to actually go searching for. What do we need to know about a particular topic? How does it relate to the question, etc., and how much time we should spend on particular areas. So if we were looking at a question related to the effects of television and aggression, for instance, the model, the inverted pyramid that I've put on slide 12, pretty much covers the areas that I think that I need to cover to engage that question. Remember, and I'll emphasise this here and probably elsewhere in the lectures, that we start with very general positions. So we'll look at just the nature of television, its history and its possible impacts, just generally, just for an overview that will inform our introduction. We then move to the more specific, which is about behaviour and aggression, so we need to know something about that from a whole range of different factors, including psychological, social, emotional, etc. So we need to do some possibly more specific but still general reading about behaviour. Then we want to look at directly the links. Is there some sort of connection between aggression and television watching? And then so that could be, we might include adults in that, and then beyond that we'll look at children, aggression and specific reading. So those are the journal articles, etc., that relate specifically to that material. On slide 13, I've had a look at if I actually went through the process, which I did, looking at, okay, what are the social impacts of television? And I've pulled out two rather interesting quotes, looking at aggression from looking at psychology. So I need a definition of what aggression is, and that's a bit of advice I'd always give you. Define your terms in the context of your writing. Treat your audience as though they don't know what you're talking about, and explain them in the context in which you're using them and how you're going to apply them in your work. Anyway, going to the more specific, we've got television and aggression, looking at investigations into that phenomenon, if there is indeed one, and then right down to children television, which cuts to the core of the actual question and what we should be trying to answer. So on slide 14, I've got a general picture of a basic essay structure. So what you would do is model your answer using this particular framework for actually doing an essay. And remember, essays are simply formulaic in a sense that it's a written argument, has to be presented in a certain format, has to have a coherence and a logic. It certainly has to have a structure, and the structure is fairly straightforward. For those who are doing academic writing, I won't go over it here. But in essence, if you follow this structure, you can apply it to any topic that you're writing about. On slide 15, I hope I point you in the direction of another PowerPoint that's on there. It's about unpacking the question. It's in the week 7 module as well. Have a look at it in your own time if you could, and obviously attempt the exercises on Milo, analyse the essay question, for instance. I know some of these are possibly repetitious in terms of academic writing if you are doing that or you're going to do that, but for me it's all good practice. I know the lecture is fairly short this week, fairly to the point. For the most part, the lecture for attending students is about the activities that they do, that they engage. What I intend to do in week 7 is discuss assignment 2. I'd recommend that all distance students have a look at the information that's given in the unit outline for what you have to do for assignment 2, and I was simply going to go over it again in class. And for the second point, I was simply going to look at the project and begin to build a working base for students to engage in the project itself. I know that it's preempting the assignment 2, but personally I see assignment 2 as a fairly mechanical task, that you should be able to do fairly efficiently, given that you've got the background and knowledge now. But the project is a slightly bigger deal. I just want to make sure that all of my attending students and distance students are on board with what's coming. Anyway, have a great week.